Welcome this evening to Something Better, a series of talks and events hosted by St. Andrew the Great Church. My name is Sarah, and it's really great to be with you this evening. You're really welcome with us, and welcome if you're joining us on the live stream as well. We really hope that these Something Better events are a chance for everyone, whether you'd call yourself a Christian or not, to investigate some of the big questions of life, and in particular, to think about the question and the claim of Jesus that he offers life to the full. This evening, we're joined by Dr. Peter Williams. Peter's going to join me in a minute. He's a New Testament scholar at Cambridge University, and he's the author of the book, Can We Trust the Gospels? Peter will speak this evening for around half an hour, and then we'll take a short break and come back for questions. We really love questions, and we'd love to hear all your questions this evening. The way you'll be able to ask your questions is via a platform called Pigeonhole. It's popping up on the screen there. You might want to get your phone out now and scan the QR code, or go to the website link there. That screen will disappear in a few minutes' time, so you might want to take your opportunity to do that now. When you get on that link, you can post a question. You can also vote for other people's questions, and we'll start by asking the most popular questions this evening. So yeah, we'd love questions. Please be asking them throughout the evening. A few more practical details before we get going. If you're looking for the toilets, they're at the back over there. And we'll be all done this evening by 9:15 p.m. Well, that's all from me at the front. I'd love to invite Peter up, so maybe we could welcome him to the front.
Well, good evening, everyone. It's great to be here. I hope you can all hear me, and hopefully I've got a presentation coming up on the screen. Jesus, the evidence. I thought we'd dive right in. What's the evidence for Jesus? And I thought we'd dive in with some of the non-Christian sources that we have for that evidence. So we can just have the next slide. I want to dive in with a guy called Tacitus. So he's a Roman historian, born around the year 56 in Rome, the capital of the Roman Empire. And around the year, in the year 64, there is a big fire in Rome. And it was thought that Nero had started it, Nero the emperor. And so that made him unpopular. And so this is how Tacitus tells the story of how Nero dealt with that. But neither human help nor gifts from the emperor, nor all the ways of placating heaven could stifle the scandal or dispel the belief that the fire had taken place by order. That's order of Nero. Therefore, to scotch the rumour, Nero substituted as culprits and punished with the utmost refinements of cruelty a class of men loath for their vices whom the crowd called Christians. Now notice they got the name slightly wrong. They called them Christians, but then Tacitus is correct. He says, I'll tell you where the name comes from. Next slide. Christus, Latin for Christ, the founder of the name, had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius. Now, Tiberius was emperor from the year 14 to the year 37. We're going to come back to that. Okay, I won't test you, but you need to put that in your mind. On the sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea from the year 26 through to the year 36. So we get to know when exactly Christ was put to death from a non-Christian historian. And then it says, and the pernicious superstitions, he doesn't like Christianity at all, was checked for a moment, only to break out once more, not merely in Judea, the home of the disease, could have written for The Guardian, couldn't he? But also in the capital, Rome itself, where all things shameful, horrible and shameful in the world collect and become fashionable. Well, okay, I like Rome a bit more than that. But anyway, what you can see here is he also tells you where it all began. It all began in Judea. So we've got the time, we've got who done it, and we also have the geographical location. Now, just to get a bit of geography, the distance from Jerusalem, the capital of Judea, to Rome is the same as from Rome to the Shetland Islands. And the Shetland Islands are, you all know this, of course, but two lots of islands above the top of Scotland. It's a long way. Christianity had spread, and here we are in the year 64, where there are Christians enough to blame in Rome for a fire, okay? And Christianity has therefore spread far and fast. Next slide. Then he goes on to explain what happens to these Christians. First, then, the confessed members of the sect were arrested. Next, on their disclosures, vast numbers were convicted. Not so much on the count of arson as for hatred of the human race. Yeah, it's good old hate crimes back then. Okay, hatred of the human race. And derision accompanied their end. And they were covered with wild beast skins and torn to death by dogs, or they were fastened on crosses and burned to serve as lamps by night. And so what you can see there is how difficult it was being a Christian. And Christianity has spread we're going to take about 30 or so years from Judea all the way to Rome, I guess the way your map goes. That's a long thing. Now, that just, I think, gives us a bit of a basis for thinking about how stories about Jesus Christ could arise. Because a lot of people like the idea that after a long time, people started making up stories about Jesus. But the further and the faster Christianity has spread, the harder it is going to be to start a new story late on and getting all those people who have chaotically spread out to agree that that was the original message. Furthermore, you've got to explain, how does Christianity even get started? How could there get to be a large number of people following Christ in Rome? He talks about vast numbers there. It's hard to imagine all of that, but of course you could do. Now, that's one Roman historian, and he's thought to be one of the best Roman historians, and he's writing about what happened in his hometown of Rome. Okay, he was a kid at the time, but he's the first guy to mention the Scottish lochs. You know, he's able to get information from a long way away and distant times. Okay, our next guy is Pliny. Pliny is writing a creepy letter around the year 112 to the emperor, and he's saying, "Oh, dear emperor, you're so wise. Please, can you tell me, am I doing the right thing about these Christians?" And so he talks about what he does with Christians, and he says, "I interrogated them as to whether they were Christians, these particular people. If they confessed, I interrogated them a second and a third time, threatening punishment. If they persisted, I ordered them to be led off, namely led off to execution." Okay? Now, Pliny here is a moderate. Pliny the Younger, not the elder, his uncle who died in the eruption of Vesuvius. He's a moderate. He's only going to bump off those who persist as Christians. You see, he's got a middle course, not bump off all people, name that just if they persist. Okay? That's very kind of him, isn't it? As for those who denied it, that they ever were Christians and had been Christians, when they invoked the gods in words given by me and prayed with incense and wine offerings to your statue, which I had ordered to be brought for this very purpose, along with the images of gods, and also cursed Christ, which it said that no true Christian could ever be compelled to do, I thought they would be discharged. Well, that's very nice of you. Notice he's got these tests for whether someone's a Christian. Are they prepared to worship the Roman gods? And are they prepared to curse Christ? And already distinguishing between a true Christian and those who are just Christians in name, which I think is a fascinating distinction that's all the way back there. But notice that what he's doing is he's got a test that only works if Christians aren't allowed to worship Roman gods. Now, where does Christianity come from? Christianity, even the name Christ, is a Latin transcription of a Greek word which comes from Hebrew word Messiah. It's a group of people following the Messiah. And so this group of people think the Jewish promised deliverer, the Messiah, has come. Now, mathematical question. How many gods do Jews believe in? One, right? And that's just a mathematical thing. You can't sort of split the God, you can't multiply the God. There's only one God. This test only works if Christianity has continued the Jewish belief that there's only one God. Because it's a very important thing. I mean, if Christians could have just said, "Oh, I'll worship the emperor, get off the punishment," they would have done. But a lot of them were not willing to do this, and they were prepared to die rather than worship the emperor. Now, let's look at the next slide. Because the next slide talks about a document which named some people as Christians. Others named in the document said that they were Christians. They later denied it, saying they had been, but they'd ceased 3 years ago, or many years ago, or even as much as 20. So here we are in the year about 112, give or take 1 or 2 years, talking about a description given by people who've given up on Christianity of what went on in a Christian meeting in the first century, 20 years ago. Okay? They said this had been the full extent of their guilt or error. They'd been accustomed to meet on a fixed day before dawn. Why do you have to meet church so early? Because the slaves can't get time off work to come to church, okay? So don't complain about your early morning services, right? On a fixed day before dawn, and to sing antiphonally, that's one group to another, Christ as to a God. Now, some of you have done Latin, and you know that in Latin there is no word for a, and there's no word for thee. So when it says quasi deo, as if to God, as if to a God, as if to the God, it's the same thing. It could mean any of those except for this. We've already realized that the Christians have kept up the Jewish thing that there is only one God. You only worship one being. So if they are worshipping Christ as God, somehow they must have identified him as the God of the Jews, which is a pretty phenomenal thing for a group that comes from within Judaism to do, right? That's just stunning. And here I am, not reading the Bible, I'm just telling you from non-Christian sources how much you can derive. Christianity begins and it spreads far and fast. And don't tell me that it was after a long, long, long time that people eventually decided, oh, we're going to call Jesus God. You know that story that first people thought Jesus was a special human, then he was a very special human, then a very, 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 very special human, and soon he was quarter of the way to God, and then halfway, and then all the way. What's the mathematical problem with that? Well, how many gods do Romans have? How many gods do Greek had? Lots. And you can have the Percy Jackson story. You know what happens? That one of the big gods gets together with some girl or whatever, and they get together and they get someone half God, demigod, right? And you can keep multiplying the number of gods all the time. In Judaism, you can't do. You can never have 1.5 gods. So there's no evolutionary path. There's no path of development to get from believing in one God to gradually pushing Jesus up to quarter God, half God, all the way to another. It doesn't work. The only way it can happen is if you've identified Jesus as the God of the Jews, the God who created the universe. So that's the stunning thing that we find from this. And then it will go on talk about many people of every age and both sexes have been called to trial. And he says it's not just the cities that are being affected. Farmsteads are being affected. In fact, the temples are almost deserted. Sacrificial meat is hardly being bought. So many people have become Christians. Now that, for me, is not really fertile ground for some of the stories that people have for how it all arose. Let's have our next slide. I want to consider another witness. This time is a Jewish witness. Now, the last two we've looked at, one was in Rome and the other one is in northwest Turkey, Bithynia. This time we're looking at Josephus, who comes from the city where it all began, the city of Jerusalem. And he talks about how there was a power vacuum around the year 62 when the high priest stepped in, because there was no Roman governor around at the time, and it said he assembled the Sanhedrin, the top group of religious group of the country, of judges, and brought before it the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James. And by the way, that's a figure we read about in the Christian documents as a leader in the early church, and some others, and made an accusation against them as breakers of the law and had them stoned. So what you've got is not just that people a long way away are prepared to die for this. Actually, you've got people who are family members. Now, I believe that James was a younger brother of Jesus, a younger half-brother, because I believe Jesus didn't have a human father. We can get into that if you like questions. But the point is, I'm a youngest brother, but I think I know where my older brothers were born. So something like that. If there's someone like that around in the early church, don't tell me that it's possible to make up a story, let's say the Christmas story, that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Don't tell me that the place of Jesus' birth got changed amongst the early Christians 30, 40, 50 years on, because there are too many Christians spread too far. So it has to be there from early on, but early on there are still family members around. So it's quite a striking thing about what we can infer just from these non-Christian documents. Next slide. Just a little summary there about some of the things that we can see from some non-Christian documents. But now I want to sort of set it in context, next slide, with actually looking at the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You've got John's Gospel there in front of you. and look alongside who was the most famous man alive at the time of Jesus' ministry. Well, the Roman Emperor, Tiberius. Okay, how many biographies do we have of Jesus? 4, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. How many do we have of the Roman Emperor? 4. Okay, so we can do a little bit of comparison. The next column, next slide, is to look at just what their names are, and the next column, next slide, gives you the number of words. Now, I want you to notice that on the whole, the 4 Gospels are longer than the accounts of Tiberius the emperor, with one exception, which is Tacitus, who wrote the Annals. But Tacitus's Annals are historical records, not a biography. So they're like the life and times of the emperor. Most of that is not about the emperor. Therefore, Jesus has as much written about him as about the most famous man alive at his time. That's just incredible. We've got over 60,000 words of biography of Jesus. When do they come from? Next slide, look at the column of when our earliest manuscripts are from. So, with the Roman emperor, the earliest witnesses we have are copies from the 9th century. Now, I think they've been reliably copied. People used to copy, generally do a good job. But the earliest copies we have, and I'm afraid they're over in the other place, the earliest copy we have, they come from the 2nd century for Matthew and John. It's just incredible. Final column, I've put, when were these things written? And instead of giving you the dates, I think, for the Gospels, I've given you the dates, I put them in italics, from the world's leading Bible skeptic, Bart Ehrman. You can look him up, Bart D. Ehrman. He's a really famous skeptic, written lots of books, translated into loads of languages, and he knows a lot, okay? He dates them like this. And you can see that the biographies of the Roman emperor are generally later, with one exception. Velleius Paterculus, who's writing during the emperor's day. Well, you think, well, that's pretty good, isn't it? Except for he's thought to be the least reliable, because he completely contradicts the other 3. He only ever says good things about the emperor because it seems he's in the emperor's pay. And then suddenly he dies, like one year, didn't please the emperor. So you read the other 3, and they tell you that Tiberius is pretty mean to his enemies and pretty mean to his friends. So in fact, when you look at it, what we've got about Jesus is really good. So as you're coming to this week this time of considering Jesus, just remember we've got good documentation in the Gospels. When your Christian friends are talking about Gospels, they're things to take seriously. Let's have the next slide. Now, I thought we'd give another comparison. You've heard of Alexander the Great. Okay, big dude. Here we got 5 biographies in, the 5 main biographies. Now, just look at the final column there. What's the gap between the time of Alexander the Great and the writing of those biographies? You see how big they are. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of years. So with Jesus, we got 4 biographies, over 60,000 words from within a century, far less than that, I think within decades. With Alexander the Great, we're talking about centuries. So again, this doesn't mean it's all true, but it does mean you should take it seriously relative to anything else. Let's look at the next slide. There is one particular person, Caesar Augustus, who seems to have a pretty good documentation of him. And after he died in the year 14, he had commands to put up his own autobiography on a monument in Rome, and that was almost automatically copied to be in Turkey. And so here is the copy on a wall in Turkey. This is thought to be the greatest classical inscription, the greatest Roman inscription. It really is an amazing thing. And it's about 40% of the length of the shortest gospel, okay? And this is Augustus' own account, but it comes from so close to his time, written just after he died. Let's have the next slide. This is how it begins. What's the whole thing about? It's his acts of Augustus and all the money he used to give out. And as you read through this, you read about how he gave money here and he gave money there. He gave money everywhere. You read this, you never think the Roman emperor took a dime from anyone. You know, he's just giving money out. What's the point of being Roman emperor if you don't take money from people? That was their job. You know, and they're trying to grab money the whole time. But you would read his account and you would think he was just there for the philanthropy of it. So in other words, you can have these accounts that are really quite close, but they're not reliable. You look at the Gospels. They do not whitewash the early followers of Jesus. The early followers of Jesus, don't come off lightly. They're described as people who denied him, fled from him, abandoned him. And they're the people who led early Christianity. It's very different from propaganda. Next slide. Now, one of the things we can do with the Gospels, we actually start to test them. We can test and see how much do they know. So next slide. One of the tests we can do is do they just know the places? Do simple geographical tests. And you can see that all 4 Gospels mention different town names. So they haven't all copied from each other. They know town names, they know villages. That's an interesting thing. Because if I were to write about somewhere I'd never been and never made detailed inquiry about, there's just no way I would be able to write all that sort of stuff. Now, they're not writing it to make it look authentic. It's just sort of details they're putting in there to tell you the story. But as you test it, you find that on test after test after test, it works. So if someone to write about Cambridge and write about all the hills in Cambridge, like Pound Hill, Pease Hill, hills. Castle Hill, okay, it's almost a hill. But people could, if they'd never been here, they could just get everything so wrong. They could be calling our punts gondoliers or whatever it was. But someone with local knowledge doesn't make that sort of mistake. But the Gospels, you can test them. Let's have the next slide. Because there you see the land of Israel goes up and down all the time. Every time they use the verb of motion and they say he went up to Jerusalem, they get it right. Or down from Jerusalem. Always. Next slide. They get it not just between Jerusalem, the capital, they get it in other places. You can look at the Gospels, they're using the correct verbs for going up and down. Now again, that's really easy if you are a local or if you've had really detailed conversations with a local. But if you're living a long way away, that is totally non-trivial. It is before Google back then, before Wikipedia, all those sort of things. How would you find out stuff out? It's a miracle, isn't it? Okay, next slide. Another test you can do is just a test of what people are called. Now, you look at sort of what people were called 100 years ago. There were lots of women called Pearl, and that isn't such a common name, but names come around in cycles. You look at any demographic over time, any place over time, you're going to find that the names change. So we can actually do the test of names, next slide, by compiling name data from bone boxes, historians, Dead Sea Scrolls, and so on, for the land of Israel and Judea and so on. And we can actually look at the ranks of names in the 4 Gospels and the book of Acts, which is associated with them. It's early history of the early church. And we can look at that, compare with outside the Gospels. We find, the top name inside the Gospels is the same as the top name outside for Palestinian Jewish men. It's Simon. Second name is Joseph, and it matches up. And next slide, you can compare actually large groups of data, because even amongst Jews, they varied from place to place. The Jewish names in the catacombs in Rome are very Latin. The Jewish names in Turkey are very different. The Jewish names in Egypt are very different. The group of Jewish names we have from Israel fit with the characters you get. Next slide. Compare that with what's going on in Egypt, and you'll find there were popular Jewish names like Ptolemaeus, Pappus. Do you know anyone called Pappus or Ptolemaeus? No. Or Sabbatai. Why not? Because the Gospels weren't written about Jewish men in Egypt. If they had been, it'd be popular. Now, we often forget names, don't we? Names are really hard to remember. One of the hardest things to remember, because they're so random. How are they attached to people? They don't really. But that means that as you look around this room, you might know people and know all sorts of things about them, what they do, your last conversation, where they come from, but you just can't remember their name. Yeah? That happens all the time. So think about it. If the Gospels are correctly getting the information that's the hard thing to remember, there's every reason to think they can get the easy stuff, namely the storyline, correct. And it also falsifies the idea that, again, the Gospels have just come through a process of transmission over several steps, because if things happen over several steps, you're not going to get that sort of information preserved. Next slide. Now, I want to come on to things that the Gospels record about Jesus. And there is this thing that Jesus is a really remarkable figure, we're going to talk about that, and that he dies on a cross, and 3 days later, according to the unanimous Christian tradition, he rises again, and there's an empty tomb. We say, well, can you find me that in the secular sources? Now, let's remember, that inscription in Turkey of Augustus was the longest secular source we have of anything from the Roman world. right? Like contemporary written on stone. Often people think there are far more sources than there are. So in fact, don't think that there are loads of sources sloshing around so you can reconstruct what happened on every day in Palestine. The Gospels are some of the very best historical sources we have, even from the land of Jesus, the time of Jesus. So, they tell us that Jesus rose from the dead. There's an empty tomb, but not just an empty tomb. Next slide. You actually see that there are loads of people who claim to have seen Jesus risen from the dead. And you look in the Gospels and in 1 Corinthians, a letter written by Paul early on within the first 20 years of Christianity, they're claiming that Jesus met people morning and evening by prior appointment, without prior appointment, up a mountain, by a lake, up in the north, down in the south, indoors, outdoors, groups of men, groups of women, individuals, always speaking. There's always interaction. It's not just, oh, I saw someone in the distance, there was a slight flicker, I was staring towards the sun and began to see something. Nothing like that. This is really encounters, not visions, okay? That's what's being described. Now, if it's just a question of how can a tomb be empty, maybe you could get people to rob a body. What's the point? You know, can't really sell it. They're a bit heavy. Okay, but you could do that, but that won't explain why lots of people see him risen from the dead. But it's not just that that happens. Next slide. It's also the fact that those two things together combine. And next slide, they combine on a remarkable person. This is my last slide, but I just want to talk about it for a bit. Jesus is a remarkable person. You'll be hearing about him. Lots of people feel that their life has been changed by Jesus. People don't go to prison, pick up Richard Dawkins' God delusion, and turn over a new leaf to a completely changed life. But loads and loads of people, lots of them, thousands, go to prison, meet Jesus, and their life is completely changed. So many stories we could tell you. But there are all sorts of things about Jesus that are remarkable. Just starting at top left. Story climax. What do I mean by this? The concluding scene, or the big scene in the New Testament, if you read the Gospels, builds up to Jesus dying on a cross, okay? Which is a form of tree. And that's the climax, the storyline climax, along with the resurrection of the story of Jesus. And that is in the New Testament, which is written by Christian followers of Jesus. But it's the second bit of the Bible. And how does the Bible begin? Well, you can go down to the synagogue just opposite St. John's and ask them how their Bible begins. And you'll find basically at nearly the opening scene of the Bible, there is a scene at a tree where humans disobey God and death and alienation from God come along. Now, if that's the way your story begins, how should the story end? The amazing thing is that Jesus' life, as historically attested by sources that are not just Christian sources, exactly finds an amazing counterpart to the beginning of the Jewish scriptures, which Christians couldn't do anything about changing. They were just there beforehand. He makes an amazing storyline. Second one, just down at 10 o'clock, he's a history shaper. I mean, we know that. Just think of all the change that's come about because of Jesus in history. At 2 o'clock, great storyteller. I've just sent off a book to a publisher last night about Jesus being an amazing storyteller, analysing his story in Luke chapter 15 of the prodigal son. My argument is this is an amazing story because he could teach two types of people simultaneously, two different levels. That's an amazing thing, and I do some other remarkable storytelling. But, you know, even without my book, I can tell you, lots of people have found Jesus to be an amazing storyteller, stories like the Good Samaritan and so on. So that's a remarkable thing. And you say, well, how do we know he said them? Well, read the book, it will come out sometime. But even better than that, you've got to think that just as Jesus comes along, these stories start arising. And they're occurring in copies of the New Testament that are really early, and they're not around before. So it does seem that they arise with him. They do seem to come from him. But it's not just that. He's also an innocent sufferer. That's something we really look to. Someone who is prepared, it seems willingly, according to the story, to go to suffering on our behalf. Because of our sin against God, he's prepared to take the punishment for us. And then there at 5 o'clock, he's a great teacher. It's not just stories. the positive golden rule to do unto others what you'd have them do to you. The judge not that you be not judged. These are sayings which are attributed to Jesus really early on that just suddenly arise. And there are so many of those sorts of wise things. Turn the other cheek. Elon Musk tweeting the other day, I mean, he does tweet a bit, about how this was an amazing teaching. He didn't mention it came from Jesus. He just said it's an amazing teaching. Turn the other cheek. And how much could be solved with that? Now, the ones that are in red, they're things that I can't demonstrate historically today or even necessarily another day. But what I want to point out is this, is there are lots and lots of really remarkable things about Jesus. And some of those can be shown to be very, very plausible historically. And therefore, we should consider all of them because there's just starting to be a cluster of really remarkable things about Jesus. And maybe rather than thinking, I can't believe that because it's, miracles spoil patterns. What about thinking this? Maybe Jesus is making the pattern. Maybe Jesus is the one who makes sense of life. And whatever's going on in your life, I think Jesus is the one who can make sense of it. Thank you very much for listening, and over to Sarah.
Well, thank you so much, Peter. You've given us lots to think about. So we're going to take a quick breather now, stretch our legs, talk to the people around you. Another chance to ask questions as well. Maybe we could have the pigeonhole slide back up on the screen. Do be submitting questions. I think some have come in already. Do be submitting more. We love any question. We'll put them to Peter in a minute. Do be voting for questions as well. We'll take a breather for a few minutes, and we'll be back together. I'll call us back together, and we'll put our questions to Peter. Great. Okay, everybody. We're gonna make a start on some questions. Thanks so much. We've had loads of questions coming in. We'll try our best to get through as many as possible. Let's make a start with this one. Peter, this one is about bias. You've demonstrated that early sources have bias. Shouldn't we have a similar level of skepticism when reading Christian sources? History is written by the winners.
Yep. So the question of bias is an interesting one because you can't really escape it. Imagine someone goes to their doctoral examination and their examiners say, we think you're biased in favor of your thesis being valid. I mean, well, of course they are. Or someone accuses you of something terrible. Well, of course you're biased in favor of, defending yourself. Bias isn't always wrong, as in people can have a passion about things. So I have a passion towards my friends, and there's something about if someone were to accuse them of something, I have a natural bias to start by defending them. Obviously you do sometimes need to look into things and question that. But yes, the early Christians are passionate about Jesus, but they can be passionate for a reason. Like Zelensky's passionate for a reason. Yeah, he's not trying to say he's neutral. So I was coming across a really nice Ukrainian website that said, we are a propaganda website. A Ukrainian, we're wanting to bolster good stories about Ukraine. Now, obviously, the early Christians, yes, they're passionate about Jesus, but for a reason. How should we approach that? Well, I've got to remember that there are other biases that go on. For instance, if Christianity is a thought system that involves, and it's more than a thought system, but it involves that there's a God who owns you, you might have an interest in not being owned, for instance. So that can be a bias that can work the other way. So I would say that there isn't a neutrality, and Christianity isn't pretending to be neutral, but there is this thing that as a scholar who's also passionate about Christianity, I want to test as thoroughly as possible any argument I use, because I know that if I don't, it will come back and bite me. And so I think that Christians also have a reason for not wanting to just tell lies. Well, one of the reasons is they believe that God's watching everything they're doing, and they're accountable to him. They believe that Jesus is the truth, and it doesn't help his cause to tell lies. So I think there's lots of things where the early Christian sources, they do have a point of view, But we shouldn't reject things for that. I mean, surely just not caring about anything is the worst possible position. And by the way, this idea that academics should not get emotionally involved in subjects is absolutely ridiculous. Emotions help the memory. If you want to remember anything, have emotions about it. So I think Christians are doing exactly the right thing in the early sources. But there we are. Yeah, talk more about that.
Thanks, Peter. That's really helpful. Let's move on to this question about some of the evidence and particularly what that shows. So it says, it seems like you laid out lots of evidence that the accounts are early and written by Jesus' early followers, but that doesn't actually prove the miracles actually happened or that Jesus is God.
And you can't. You can't prove that anything has a value using science. Often what people are trying to do is they're trying to say, let's use some scientific proof of something. You can't prove all sorts of things. You can't prove your mother loves you. I mean, try it. I mean, how would you, every single action that you might say was evidence that she loves you could just be some cynical form of behavior, couldn't it?
Thanks for that.
Yeah, I mean, so this is where, what a useless way of evaluating life. You can't prove it's worth getting up in the morning. Do you know that? You have to believe it's worth getting up in the morning, as in your values precede things. And this is the key thing. You cannot prove that there is a value to science using science. Okay? There's no scientific experiment to show you the value of science. You have to believe in it to do it. Christianity believed in the values of science, therefore science arose. You see? That's the way it works. So I think this idea that someone ought to be able to prove to you that a miracle happens is somewhat ridiculous. But I would say this. Obviously, people want to know evidence. Is there evidence? Yes, there is evidence. But the evidence comes within a system of the whole plausibility of Christianity. Now, if you believe in a basically materialistic universe where nothing miraculous ever happens, and someone tries to explain to you evidence that something miraculous happened, you will always explain it away, because it's just impossible within that universe, right? Within that universe that you've got in your mind. But I would say, look, that universe in your mind may just be in your mind rather than the way things actually are. All sorts of people believe things that are quite implausible. I mean, people believe consciousness comes from unconsciousness, and they don't, non-consciousness, and they don't ask for super duper evidence for that, or that something comes from nothing. Those are just a couple of examples. So I'd want to say, all sorts of different point of views have miracles. The question is, which miracles make the most sense? And the miracles in Christianity are not random things. They're actually making a semiotic pattern. That's a fancy way of it. They're making they're signaling things. They've got meaning. They fit together. That's how we try to make sense of the universe. So I think you can accept that Jesus makes sense of the universe, and Jesus' miracles go along with that. Can I provide evidence for it? Yeah. I mean, I think there's good evidence for the resurrection and other miracles of Jesus.
That's helpful because it links to a few other questions about evidence and faith. So someone's asking, do you think we need evidence for our faith? Kind of flip side.
Yeah, so faith is a tricky word because it's been redefined over the last couple of 100 years. It comes from the Latin word fides, which I tend to think as the word trust. Okay. You trust that a particular restaurant's going to be good because it's recommended, a particular brand's going to be good. You trust Google Maps because generally they seem to be it right. You've got all sorts of reasons for it. That's how we're wired. We are social creatures, and all of our lives are built on trust. We have food prepared by other people. What we trust is not poison. That's how we live. Science is built on trusting the testimony of others, because the number of scientific experiments that anyone's done is just a tiny amount of all the scientific things they actually believe. I believe there's a place called Antarctica. I've never been there, but I trust. But is that evidence-based trust? Yes, it is. As in, there's good reason to trust those sorts of things. So what I say is that a good way of thinking about Christianity and what our invitation is personal trust. Now, how do you decide that someone is trustworthy? How do you decide, that a friend is trustworthy or whatever? Actually, we humans, we sometimes get it wrong, we sometimes get betrayed, but we're pretty wired to detect trustworthiness. And I think that's the category I'd want to come, with. As in, you've got evidence. At the end of the day, yes, you sometimes have to trust something. That's what you do when you eat food prepared by others.
Fair enough. And someone here is honing in particularly on the evidence for Jesus' resurrection. You alluded to that. Can you say a bit more? What is the evidence for Jesus' resurrection?
So I think the evidence would be a combination of things. So I think you've got the empty tomb, and certainly the fact that he died, well attested, the tomb is empty, and then you've got all these different people, and it can't just be one lot of people who made up all of these different accounts, who said they had encountered Jesus. Now, I should just unpack that. We've got 27 documents in the New Testament written by Christians, all of which presupposing Jesus is alive. A lot of them give you more detail on the Gospels in particular, and also 1 Corinthians, of encounters with Jesus. And you can work any theory about the relationships between these documents. They don't all come from the same one source or anything. That clearly lots and lots of people are going around saying, I met Jesus. But it's not just that. It's also that in the bit of, if I go to the Old Testament, the first major section of the Bible, which again you can go to your synagogue to check that we're talking about the right text, I will find in that a passage like Isaiah chapter 53, which will talk about an innocent sufferer, described in terms that are rather like God, suffering on behalf of his people, and uses 5 different terms to describe him dying, and then we'll talk about him living again. And the fact is, that is written before the time of Jesus and exists in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's not just that you've got the empty tomb and the resurrection appearances, but the fact that that doesn't just happen to a random person from Grantchester. It happens to someone from a really particular place, from the Jewish people, who exists in the context of all of this stuff that's been written before. It makes a story that fits with the first bit of the Bible. All sorts of things in Jesus' life correspond with that. He also happens to be an amazing storyteller, an amazing teacher. His death actually makes a message which brings life. All of those things together, and you start saying, aha, here's a pattern. This is making sense of life. It's the non-randomness of this. So I'm not just telling you it's like a spooky story. Yeah, there was a creaky staircase, whatever it was. Something random happening in the middle of nowhere. Actually, it's something that just forms a whole load of patterns together. I haven't had enough time to talk about those patterns, but I'd love to. Great. I mean, he doesn't just die at any time of the year. He dies in Jerusalem, Jewish capital, just as they're celebrating their greatest festival, which is when they were delivered from Egypt and slaughtering all sorts of lambs, which they see their blood as substituting for themselves. I mean, this is all going on at the same time.
Thanks, Peter. That's great. And maybe people want to pick up on some of those things and ask more questions about it. We'll come back now to a question about the Jews. You said quite a bit about the Jewish scriptures, Jesus being, the Christians believing Jesus to be God, the Jewish Messiah.
Yep.
You said it was stunning. Lots of Jews believed Jesus was God, but weren't there lots of other Jewish Messiah claimants? How is that proof for Jesus' divinity?
So again, I wouldn't use the word proof. But what I would say is, yes, of course, Jesus was a figure that people divided over. There were people who accepted that he was the Messiah, and there were those who didn't, but both lots of Jews. But what I would say is convincing anyone, any Jew who believes there's only one God, that God has come down to earth in the form of a human who can be touched, and has died the most shameful death the Romans could imagine, which crucifixion is the Romans' way of showing they're in charge, this guy's a loser, okay? To convince any Jews at all that someone who is that small and has died that shamefully is the ruler of the universe who made it, that's a stunning thing. So that's where I would say it's rather the evidence that any believed in him at all. I mean, that is, if you are going to write a message for plausibility in the Roman Empire, it completely loses. Because, Romans tended to have more Platonic ideas about, when you died, you didn't want to come back again in a physical shape. You wanted to go to the area of thought and realm and spirit. So the idea that, and so someone who's been publicly shamed as a loser has somehow come back physically. That is not the way to write a message if you're going to try marketing something in the Roman world. So how do you explain that it spread so quickly? I'd say one explanation is the fact that it really happened and there were witnesses. It was undeniable.
Thanks, Peter. There's a question here about Gospels not in the Bible. You talked about the Gospel of John that we have on our seats among other Gospels, but someone here says, I believe there are other Gospels not in the Bible.
Yep.
Do they tell a different story? If so, why are the ones in the Bible considered the historically accurate
Yeah.
ones?
Even the world's leading Bible skeptic, Bart Ehrman, would say the 4 Gospels come before the other ones copy on. And you could look at the Penguin translation of Apocryphal Gospels, which is made by Professor Simon Gathercole here in Cambridge, and that will give a really good introduction to how those other Gospels are all later than the 4 Gospels. And in fact, you can see signs that they copy them. They don't pass the geography test, they don't pass the name test, they don't know the other bits of culture, but they are clearly later. And there was never a sort of committee that sat down and said, oh, you've got 10, 20 Gospels, let's choose these 4. Those 4 were just way earlier than the others.
Great, thank you. Carrying on thinking about the content of the Bible, which chapter or event of the Bible do you consider to be the least plausible? Interesting question.
That's an interesting question. I mean, I struggle to answer a question like that. I mean, there are, because I guess I find it all to be plausible. Which things would be harder to defend? There's a bit in the resurrection account in Matthew, which has got not just, as Jesus dies, it talks about other people being raised, and people sometimes raise questions about that. The only testable bit of the account is the fact that Matthew's got an earthquake, or 2 earthquakes, in fact, and you can test the valves for the particular sediment for the Dead Sea around that time, and you've got valves at roughly the right time for the earthquake. So, there's a bit implausible, that might seem implausible to us. Like in my armchair sense, I think, oh, that's hard to imagine, but that's really armchair. But then there's another bit that's really testable alongside it. Deadseaquake.info if you want to know the details.
Oh, good to know. Thanks so much again for questions coming in. Do keep sending them in to Pigeonhole. We'll try to get through as many as we can. Here's a question about science. What about modern science? Doesn't it explain things better in the Gospels, like miracles, demon possession? Doesn't modern science explain those things?
It's a really interesting thing, isn't it? Modern science, what it explains. Pure evil. What went on in Bucha in Ukraine? Just, we've heard the reports. I'm not going to go into the details. Just, there seems to be something gratuitous and beyond just, what's the point of the perpetrators doing those sort of things? And there is a time where I think there's a spiritual realm. There are demons, and the way I would spot demon possession is where there is really, just serious, gratuitous evil, killing, which just as we got it in the New Testament, the desire of devils is to kill and take life and limb and everything like that. And I just think that actually a lot of people are using language of there's a bigger evil here than people imagined. You see, if you're simply trying to say, humans are basically rational, or we're not quite rational because we're a bit physical as well, but, basically cooperative, how do you explain the pure evil of a phone call with a Russian soldier to his wife about, how he's going to rape people? And this, just when you hear this stuff, it's just, doesn't your blood boil, make you think, actually it's something, I don't see how science explains that sort of penchant to evil that humans have. The way soldiers were just killing animals for the fun of it. I mean, there is this thing, it's not, with a human, they might say, well, they're revenging. They're not doing that with an animal. Obviously, I think humans matter more than the animals, but just in terms of what's going on, it's absolutely horrific evil. Don't tell me that modern science explains that.
If that links to questions about evil and suffering for you personally, we've actually got an event on Saturday evening that it might be interesting to come back to. You might find that really helpful, directly attacking that question of suffering and thinking about that. Great. Let's keep going with some of these. There's another question here about the resurrection, if you have to come back to that.
Great.
Thanks, Vincent, who sent this in. If Jesus came back from the dead, would this extraordinary event not have been recorded by secular people as well? For example, the Roman governor.
Yeah, so the thing is, we don't have any records from the Roman governor himself, because we don't generally have records from any Roman governors. So in terms of records, basically most documents don't survive. Like, I've been working on computers for, a few decades, but my files from 20 years ago, I can't really read. Documents don't generally survive in our culture, neither did they back then. As in, unless you make an effort to preserve them, they're not going to. So that's where we get better records from the sands of Egypt, where in southern Egypt only, it's super dry enough that you can go to their rubbish dumps and you can dig up lots of the papyrus and find bits, but it's very sparse. So the thought, again, the idea behind this question is that there are loads and loads of records going back. You go to the early history of Cambridge University and people don't know who most of the students were. I mean, they don't even know the names or how many students there were. So don't think that these records always survive.
So some of it is our assumptions about the kind of records.
Yeah, and again, remember, we got more written about Jesus than about the Roman emperor at the time. So don't complain about lack of records. There's loads.
We'll be grateful. There's a question about Jesus' words. How do we know the words quoted to be from Jesus were actually said by him?
Oh, that's a lot. I sent my book off to the publisher last night, and the whole book is about that. It really is. But okay. So how would I summarize that briefly? You've got 4 different Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and there's a stronger relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They're closer together than they are to John. And that's actually the optimal way, because there are things where they're both in Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. There are things that are in all 3. There are things that are in like 2 of the Gospels, and that you give lots of different sorts of material. So I'd say with the Gospels, we've actually got 6 different types of material. Things that are only in Matthew, things that are only in Luke, and so on. And what you can find is actually they have some of the same patterns. So one of the things I was writing about recently is how in the different Gospels, you have the same patterns of speech for different things. So Jesus beginning stories with questions. They're different stories in 2 different Gospels, but they're beginning with questions. Jesus grouping male and female pairs in a story. So, for instance, he tells in Luke chapter 15, story of a male shepherd going after a lost sheep, then of a woman searching for coins. But then you'll also find that he will be talking in another gospel about men out in the field and women grinding together, and these sort of things where you get that side by side. And these are sorts of patterns that you're finding in, he ends speeches in the same way in 2 different sorts of Gospels. You get some of the same vocabulary, but not the same story. Writing mainly about the story of the prodigal son, it begins, a certain man had 2 sons. That's only in Luke, okay? Jesus has a story in Matthew 21, a certain man had 2 sons, but it's a different story. So actually that looks like that's a particular way that he spoke. So you can actually do these sorts of tests of a sort of, I won't say scientific, but you can do analytical tests with the material, and you find striking things. So I'll just give you 2 more examples. In Matthew's Gospel, Matthew chapter 7, it'll talk about don't throw your pearls before pigs, don't give what's holy to dogs, don't throw your pearls before swine. And so it talks about dogs and pigs together.
Now, the funny thing is, that's in Matthew, only in Matthew. Completely different over in Luke 15 and 16, but Jesus tells two parallel stories, one with a man getting all dirty, feeding the pigs, and the other of a poor man getting licked by dogs. And you get those same sort of patterns happening again and again. And they haven't all been traced out, but there are lots of those. Just one more. Okay. In 3 of the Gospels, Jesus is reported, Matthew, Mark, Luke, as praying in the Garden of Gethsemane before he dies to his Father, saying, Father, could this cup pass from me? Okay, that's in Matthew, Mark, Luke. Over in John, you don't have that recorded, but a few moments later, as it would be, people come to arrest Jesus. Peter, the disciple, is all trying to stop them with his sword. And Jesus says to him, shouldn't I drink the cup that's been given me? And that's over in John. You think, well, that exactly fits when he's got the cup in his mind. That's why he would say that. Those sorts of patterns are happening. And often they're not commented on. Oh, what, just one more? Because they're beautiful things. The story of Jesus has these wise and foolish virgins in Matthew 25, and by the way, that's next to a story about men owing money, so they've got women-men stories adjacent. And some of them are kept out of the feast and some in, depending on whether they were ready. But there's this amazing thing where the bridegroom arrives at midnight, which is a really bizarre time to arrive, and it says a cry went up at midnight. Well, where you get a cry at midnight, the only other time in the Bible is when it was the Passover, and a cry went up at midnight, and there was division between those who were saved and those who were not. Well, guess what? Jesus is recorded as telling that story at Passover time, but it doesn't mention the link. So it's just all of these sorts of things. And there are, you could write lots and lots of those sorts of things where there are patterns that you can test that just, you think, wow, how would that all happen from a conspiracy? It would have to be the cleverest ever possible literary conspiracy to explain all that.
Thanks, Peter. And it sounds like we can hear more in your book when it comes out.
Yeah.
What is the book called?
It's called Jesus the Genius.
Jesus the Genius. Great.
Yeah,
We'll look
should
out
be coming
for
out
it.
in the autumn.
Great. I mean, you've talked about lots of evidence this evening, Peter, but how come there's no consensus? There's lots of evidence. You claim it's good evidence.
Yeah.
Why is there still no consensus?
Isn't there a thing like we've just been through a pandemic and there wasn't much of a consensus on that, but there was plenty of evidence. I mean, what I mean is, it's not that we knew as much about viruses as we'd want to, but, we've known more than we wanted to. But what I mean is, humans are going to debate anything, aren't they? I mean, look, politically or whatever it is, people debate about everything. That's what humans do. And economics, because you say there's no consensus about economics, therefore there can be no valid views. No? Economists can always defend their view by saying you haven't considered all the variables. But in life, you will make some decisions. You will make some decisions about what you live by. And we're responsible for that. So I think that's where we've got to recognize that you're already living by a philosophy and a set of values. And I just want to say there is so much reason to believe in Jesus.
Okay, so let's talk then about the spread of Christianity compared with other religions. Someone's asked a question about that. How does the spread of Christianity compare with the spread of other religions or ideas in history?
Yeah, so I think there are different sort of things. Obviously, religion's a bit of a hard category to look at, because I'd say that the key thing about Christianity is it's centered on a person, it's not about religiosity. And I think it's something that people struggle to explain, how Christianity spread so far and fast. I mean, if it wasn't true, what was it that would make this suddenly take off in the Roman Empire? Now, obviously, if people go round with military strength, they can spread a philosophy more quickly, but that doesn't require much explanation. I mean, that's easy to understand. Or if you offer people financial bribes or incentives, you can understand why that philosophy might spread. What's interesting about Christianity is the fact that it's in no one's financial interest to become a Christian, and it probably isn't going to help them live longer.
in early Christianity, and yet it's taking off. So I think there is something that's harder to explain than with the spread of other things.
And interesting, there's a question here a bit more personal. I wonder if that was the case for you, because someone's asking, at what point did your practical head knowledge spill over into a personal faith for you?
Yeah.
Was it enough to have the facts?
And I'd say no. I mean, so I grew up in a Christian home, and I went through a period of doubt as an undergraduate, and seriously, thought about leaving the Christian faith. But I think for me, what I found trustworthy is just the integrity of my parents. I mean, I've been given wonderful parents, and that for me was a key thing. And I think that's a rational thing to do. As humans, find trustworthy people and trust them. I think is a reasonable thing to do. So if someone said, the reason I believe Christianity is because I found your life to have integrity, that to me is a very rational thing to do. But obviously, I came here in 1989 and haven't managed to escape much. And I've been studying stuff since. But you can have all sorts of head knowledge and it won't map up with your life. I mean, all sorts of theological experts every now and then get caught up in amazing scandals, and that's always been the case. And the leading Bible experts of Jesus' day didn't all follow him, and they didn't all live lives of integrity.
Great, thanks Peter for sharing that. Great, I think we've got time for a few more questions before we wrap up this evening, if you're happy for a few quick fire ones, and then we'll end with another one. Let's see. What about this one? You argue that because sources accurately recall names, they're likely accurate in recalling stories as well. Changing a name is rarely useful to an agenda. Changing a story is. Is the analogy useful? Yeah,
so what I was trying to say there, maybe didn't express it very well, is about how many steps a story's been through. So I think I'm going to use the American expression, the telephone game, which I hope you understand, which I think is actually superior to the British expression for the same game, which is the idea that one person tells another the story, and of course, in that game, it's you whisper it from one person to another, and it gets corrupted. Now, if you go on holiday and you meet some interesting people and you come back and tell your friends about those interesting people, you might not even bother mentioning the name of those people because you know your friend isn't going to remember them. You focus on the story. You watch a film. You remember the story, often not the names of the characters. So that's where names tend to drop off quite early. So if the idea is that stories of miracles have grown up because they've been told over 3 or 4 successive stages, I would say you wouldn't get the right sort of names still consistently attached to them. Remember, this is a consistency that's happening across 4 different authors with 4 different writing styles. They all seem to have the right sort of characters for the time and place.
Thanks, Peter. And what about this one? Even if you take a sympathetic reading of the New Testament, there's some really unbelievable things like Noah's flood, some unethical things, Canaanite genocide. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so I mean, you're going to find that, Noah's flood is mentioned in the New Testament. It's mainly in the Old, and Canaanite genocide. I have a whole talk on that, which I won't give you now. But what I would say... Sorry?
How can we access that talk?
Oh.
Is it somewhere available? Or
maybe
no?
Search on my name and genocide, I don't know. No, maybe not.
Okay.
Old Testament morality, immoral, I don't know, something like that. But what I would say is this. Remember the Harry Potter stories and Albus Dumbledore? You could, like Rita Skeeter, the journalist, you could pick a little bit of Albus Dumbledore's life and make him look really, really bad. But actually, when you set him in the context of the whole stories, and I'm not talking about more recent films, actually he seems like the sort of figure you'd be proud of to have as your grandfather, because he always prefers giving life to taking it away. But guess what? He plans for Harry Potter to get killed. So there are different ways you can look at it. But
take the storyline of the Bible. The storyline of the Bible begins that there's a God who made everything. He is the living God, the source of all life, and guess what? He wants to share his life. He wants others to be alive. And there is nothing that follows in the story which undermines the basic understanding of God, who always prefers giving life to taking it away. He's the owner of all life, but that's a sort of fundamental thing. Now, when you read the story of the children of Israel going in and destroying the Canaanites on God's command, you've got to understand that it's completely different from any modern situation. It's a story full of miracles, and it's a situation in which those Canaanites in the story are killing their own children. Now, some people say, I don't believe the story is true. Well, if you're judging any story, you have to think of the story as having integrity. So you may not believe in, Harry Potter, or you may not believe in Gollum and the Ring and all that sort of stuff. But if you're reading stories and you're judging the goodness of characters, you have to believe in everything in the story. So for the sake of that, even as an atheist, when you're reading the Old Testament, remember God's the biggest character in the Bible. Okay? So you have to believe in God for the sake of the story, just as you have to believe in, Rings of Power when you're reading Lord of the Rings. So within that story, this is God who's commanded everything, and he's given life, and he always prefers giving life to take it away. There are people who are trying to, they're killing their children. They are given multiple miracles and opportunities to turn, and they decide not to. And so actually trying to give an analogy between that and anything that happens modern day politically just doesn't work. So I didn't express that very well, but I would just say it's not like these categories that people have. I would also say the more you read the Bible, the more grounds it will give you to see the inherent reasons within something. So often people see things a bit from a distance, and they haven't really got in and seen there's an internal logic here. But I'd say everything in the Bible is God always prefers giving life to taking it away. There are bits that you could take out of any context, like the only thing you report about a surgeon is the fact they chop someone's leg off, and you just said they're a man who chopped someone's leg off. That isn't really fair to them and their intention.
Okay, thanks, Peter. I think we're going to have to make this our last question this evening. Thank you so much for all the questions that have come in. This might be one about taking things forward from here. What's the best way for me to test what you're saying for myself? Should I read Tacitus, a Gospel, Bart Ehrman, something else? What would you recommend?
So I would say read the Gospels. So the 4 Gospels take about 9 hours to read. You can get David Suchet to read them to you on audio or something like that. And they're really good, and read them with someone. Because I think, look, if the fundamental thing, if you're looking to find out about Jesus, is these 4 biographies about Jesus. And I think if you read those, you'll see they're remarkable. And the thing you can do tonight is hopefully you've got John's Gospel on your seat. It takes about 2.5 hours to read. It's gripping. And I would say, read that. Just is a great place to start.
Thanks, Peter. That's a great recommendation. Thank you so much for answering all those questions. Thank you so much to you guys for all the questions that have come in. Sorry we didn't get a chance to go through all of them. I think Peter said he's going to stick around for a bit, so you might be able to grab him and talk to him. Can we thank Peter again? Thank you, Peter. Well, thanks again for being here with us this evening. We really hope you enjoyed this event. As Peter said, there might be a few things you want to do to keep on thinking about what we've heard this evening. I don't know about you, but I've been given lots of pause for thought about lots of questions and things to follow up on. There are a few things we might recommend. One is we've got lots more of these Something Better events coming up in the coming days. We've got an event here the same time tomorrow evening. We've got other events over the coming days. Would particularly recommend coming back on Sunday and joining us then. We're addressing 2 different questions there. Is Jesus oppressive? And why did Jesus die? Great questions to come back and see more about on Sunday. Please do browse the bookstall as well. We've got a bookstall over there that includes one of Peter's books, not his latest one, but one of his books over there about the Gospels. So do go and check that out in a minute, and there are other books there too. On your chair, also, you had 3 things. And one was that Gospel of John. You're really welcome to take that away. As Peter said, that would be a great place to go next, to read that for yourself, to actually investigate the historical documents and read them for yourself. The other thing you've also got is a flyer that says Real Life Jesus. This is something we're running on consecutive Mondays in June. It'll be very similar to this evening, thinking about the evidence for Jesus, asking questions, but a bit more informally. We'll be able to ask more questions, discuss, have a bit more Q&A. So we'd really love you to come back for that Real Life Jesus. That's happening in June. The last thing to flag up is this little feedback card. We'd love to hear your thoughts. If you've got any feedback for us, we'd love to hear that. You could pop that in a basket on your way out this evening. Thank you so much again for being with us this evening. Thank you for all your questions. We do hope this has been really helpful and sparks further discussion and conversations. But that's all from me. Thank you for being with us this evening. Enjoy the rest of your evening.